the series called My Life, God's Story. And in this series, we've been talking about our unique lives, that each one of us is individual and unique, and yet we are part of a bigger story, of a story that God is up to and what God is doing. A story about God rescuing and drawing us back to Himself. And so the question, of course, as we go into this series and as we've been talking about is, where are we in this story? In this play, if you will, or this process or this story of God unfolding, where do we rest in it? Well, the first week we talked about the story showing a contrast between creation and brokenness. That God did, in fact, make the Garden of Eden. It was a perfect place, a place of harmony and oneness, a place of walking in God and transparency and no secrets and no baggage and no hurts, no bitterness. Any of those things didn't exist. It was just a place of peace and order. And yet sin came in and broke that up. And so it ended up we became in a place of brokenness that every one of us has been at some stage of our life, and a place that society is a part of as well. That those words were replaced with words like conflict and deceit and hurt and pain and isolation and all these kind of words that describe that conflict that came out of that first act of this story. And then we moved into the second act. The second act of the story was God's promise and God's law. And in that was the imagery of how God in the story chose a people. He chose Abraham, and He came to him and said, and He made a promise to him and a vow and a covenant, say, I will be your God, and not only your God, but the God of your descendants and the descendants after you from generation to generation. And He made this covenant promise in an act of the story about how He had separated an animal and He passed alone through it as Abraham slept, signifying that if he would break His promise, that may he be like the animal that He passed through. In Genesis 15 is where that story was. And so that promise was fulfilled through the Israelites when they were delivered in Exodus, and they came to Mount Sinai, and God gave them the law. And in the law was this story about how God had described to His people what it was like to live in oneness, what it was like to live in the Garden of Eden, what it was like to live in a place of where we are right with God and we're right with each other, where we put God first and we honor Him and we keep it holy, and where we don't lie and cheat and steal and murder, but we honor each other as well. And it was a description of this holiness that was intended in the Garden of Eden. But unfortunately, it didn't create righteous people by God setting up that law. In fact, Romans 3:20 describes this, therefore no one will be declared righteous in His sight by observing the law. Rather, through the law we became conscious of sin. Which leads us to the third act of this story, of which we're going to look at today. And it's called Rebellion and Grace. If you'd like to follow along, turn with me to Nehemiah. It's page 361 if you want to use the Bibles that are in the seats. But Nehemiah is a story, and I want to do something kind of unique. Not sure how this will go, but it's good because I want to really let the passage teach and not spend a whole lot of time on me talking. I know you guys contain yourselves, be excited. But I think sometimes in a story we got to just hear the story. And see the connection and not spend all the time trying to overanalyze and figure it out, but just really kind of embrace it. And so the book of Nehemiah is a story where Israel had been in slavery again and gone, and they'd come back and they were trying to restore Jerusalem, and Nehemiah the prophet had come and the walls of Jerusalem down, and he wanted to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And so it's a story about where there is... through the disobedience, people had separated, but they came back. And in the book of Nehemiah, as they're making things right, what they do is they go through and they remember God's story. They remember the history of what God had done and looking at that. And I want us to look at that today as we go through it and read that story a little bit. But as we're doing it, I want you to look at your own life and your own story and say, does this at all describe me and my life at some point in my life? And so let's look at this. It's Nehemiah chapter 9. I want to start actually in verse 13. Before that, he goes actually farther in the story and talks about how God delivered him through the Red Sea from Pharaoh. And then verse 13, and it starts saying this. And again, they're talking about the Levites are talking to the people about God and saying, look what God did. Listen to his story. And so verse 13, he says this. They're talking to God, but in front of these people. He says, you came down on Mount Sinai. You spoke to them from heaven. You gave them regulations and laws that were just and right, and decrees and commands that are good. You made known to them your holy Sabbath and gave them commands, decrees, and laws through your servant Moses. In their hunger you gave them bread from heaven, and their thirst you brought them water from the rock. You told them to go in and take possession of the land you had sworn with uplifted hand to give them. Now, also let me say, as we're going through this rebellion and grace, this is all grace right here. That God, in his love and mercy, did all of these things they're trying to be able to show the people. But then in verse 16 it says this, but they, our forefathers, became arrogant and stiff-necked and did not obey your commands. They refused to listen and failed to remember and miracles you performed among them. They became stiff-necked and in their rebellion appointed a leader in order to return to their slavery. Rebellion is the response of God's grace that was shown by the people. But then it says, but you are a forgiving God, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love. Therefore you did not desert them. God's response, grace. Verse 18, even when they cast for themselves an image of a calf and said, this is your God who brought you out of Egypt, or when they committed unlawful blasphemy, rebellion. Verse 19, because of your great compassion, you did not abandon them in the desert. By day the pillar of cloud did not cease to guide them on their path, nor the pillar of fire by night to shine on the way they were take. You gave your good spirit to instruct them. You did not withhold your manna from their mouths, and you gave them water for their thirst. For 40 years you sustained them in the desert. They lacked nothing. Their clothing did not wear out, nor did their feet become swollen. Grace. And continued grace. You gave them kingdoms and nations, allotted them even the remote frontiers. They took over the country of Sihon, king of Heshbon, and the country of Og, king of Bashan. You made their sons as numerous as the stars in the sky, and you brought them in the land that you told their fathers to enter and possess. Their sons went in and took possession of the land. You subdued before them the Canaanites who lived in the land. You handed the Canaanites over to them, among with their kings and with the peoples of the land, to deal with them as you pleased. They captured fortified cities and fertile land. They took possessions and houses filled with all kinds of good things. Wells already dug, vineyards, olive groves, and fruit trees in abundance. They ate to the full and were well nourished, and they reveled in your great goodness. Grace. But then verse 26, but they were disobedient and rebelled against you. They put your law behind their backs. They killed your prophets who had admonished them in order to turn them back to you. They committed unlawful blasphemy. So you handed them over to their enemies who oppressed them. But when they were oppressed, they cried out to you. Rebellion. From heaven you heard them, and in your great compassion you gave them deliverers who rescued them from the hand of their enemies. Grace. But as soon as they were arrested, verse 28, they again did what was evil in your eyes. Then you abandoned them into the hand of their enemies so that they ruled over them. Rebellion. And when they cried out to you again, you heard from heaven, and in your compassion you delivered them time after time. Grace. You warned them to return to your laws, but they became arrogant and disobeyed your commands. They sinned against your ordinances, by which a man will live if he obeys them. Stubbornly they turned their backs on you, become stiff-necked, and refused to listen. Rebellion. Verse 30, for many years you were patient with them. By your Spirit you admonished them through your prophets. Grace.